Hello there. Welcome to Can't Make This Up. If you're new here, my name's Kevin. If you're a Star Wars fan, you know what I just did at the beginning of the show. Today's episode, I'm pretty excited about. My guest today is Dean Jobb. If you've been listening for a while, you are familiar with Dean. This is his third time coming onto the podcast. He is a true crime author, and he is also a professor of creative nonfiction at the University of King's College in Halifax, Nova Scotia. Today he joins us to talk about his most recent book, newly in paperback here in the United States, The Case of the Murderous Dr. Cream. This book has been doing really well. It won the inaugural CrimeCon Clue Award for True Crime Book of the Year, and it was even long-listed on the American Library Association's Andrew Carnegie Medal for Excellence in Nonfiction. This is a very good book, and Dean has been recognized quite a bit for it, and well-deserved. So very much looking forward to our conversation today. We talk about Dr. Cream, who, known as the Lambeth Poisoner, was a serial killer in the late 1800s, at the same time that the world is becoming infatuated with detective stories like Sherlock Holmes. So it's an interesting period to take a look at. We're going to learn a lot about Victorian culture, a lot about law enforcement and detective work at the time, and we're going to learn about a very interesting murder case. So I hope you'll enjoy this and that you'll stick around. If you are interested in checking out Dean's previous appearances on the podcast, where he talked about a 1920s swindler, check out Empire of Deception. If you're interested in kind of a hodgepodge of true crime tales from Dean's home, Nova Scotia, check out Daring, Devious, and Deadly. I've included links to both of those in the description of this episode in your podcast app. So check those out if you enjoy true crime and if you like today's podcast. Without further ado, Dean Jobb.
The You Can't Make This Up History Podcast, bringing you strange but true things from the past. It's not the average history that you learned in school. We're bringing you the heroes and bringing you the fools, and stories that are just too crazy to believe. The stranger than fiction and super unique.
Dean Jobb, big welcome back to you. Welcome back to the podcast.
Well, thanks very much for having me back.
This is your third time joining us here.
Well, maybe that's a record, is it? I don't know.
It is a record, actually. You're the first three-time person. For listeners who haven't heard your previous books on the podcast, tell us a little bit about yourself and your work as a true crime historian.
Well, I got into this game long before it had its resurgence, I guess, the true crime renaissance or explosion of the last few years. I was a court reporter for a daily newspaper. Background was in history, writing about historic or old cases that were interesting to me just seemed a natural progression. So 20, 30 years ago, I was writing about local stories, and I've just kept up with it. And I'm always interested in, because I'm a journalist, I want to scoop. Mm-hmm. So I want the stories that are sitting out there and have been forgotten, but not forgotten because they're not interesting, just overlooked. So when we first spoke, we spoke about a book called Empire of Deception, which was about a Chicago Ponzi schemer in the 1920s named Leo Koritz that no one had heard of. And he was so prolific that actually the Ponzi scheme, named for Charles Ponzi in Boston, he had been at this doing a pyramid scheme for a decade or more before that. And in fact, his investors started calling him our Ponzi as a joke because they were making so much money, not realizing he was a Ponzi. And it got weirder from there, because when he escapes to where I live, the province of Nova Scotia. So it actually went from a Chicago to a story in my own backyard, at least 100 years ago. Then we spoke about a book I did called Deadly, Daring, Devious, and Deadly, about Nova Scotia true crime that I'd issued. And
yeah, kind of an anthology.
It was an anthology of cases from about 200 years of Nova Scotia history. And again, just my interest in these quirky stories. So this was everything from fraud to robbery to murder. And Nova Scotia seems to be a crossroads in a way. Lots of interesting fugitives, a bank robbery that occurred during a parade by Barnum's Circus in Halifax, things like that. So, but at the end of the day, I find these cases are just so engaging, and I hope they're engaging for readers, but they're such a great window on the past. I mean, the stakes and the drama are there with true crime. I mean, there's been a horrific or some kind of crime's been committed. There has to be an investigation. Sometimes there's a manhunt. There's always inherent drama, but they also say so much about the time, whether it's the gullibility of the anything goes era of the 1920s that led to the stock market crash that I looked at in Empire, or just issues of class and race that bubble to the surface from the old cases I do, which brings us to Dr. Cream, which brings with it a host of insights into Victorian society, not all of it very attractive.
Yeah, you do a really good job of picking interesting cases. And one thing I was wondering when I was reading them, just, how do you find these people? Because not to call them outlandish, but their stories are so incredible. They're these stranger than fiction true stories, and I love them.
Well, I should point out they're totally nonfiction. As a journalist, accuracy and fact above all, but they often do read like fiction, which is why I'm very heavy on endnotes, so people realize that I haven't embellished this, and I don't think any of these stories have to be embellished. But where do I find them? It's really these are. Sometimes they're names I trip over when I'm researching another case. I sometimes think maybe I hang with the wrong crowd, historically speaking, that I run into some of these characters. But Cream, Dr. Thomas Neill Cream, it's just one of these shadowy, he's almost a caricature of the Victorian villain. I mean, I've got pictures in the book of him with the top hat and the smug expression. And I mean, he looks like, he looks like the mustachioed victim that would be tying a damsel to the railway tracks or something like that.
Whirling his mustache.
Exactly, yeah. But I knew a bit about his case. And again, he was a serial killer in the Victorian era. And by my reckoning, and I think this is as close as we'll ever get to the truth of how many he killed, a death toll of at least 10 in 3 countries. And what intrigued me again, I guess I looked at it and said, well, so what? And the so what is usually, well, what does this mean, either to us now or our understanding of the past? And what I really thought was the best lens for looking at all of these horrific murders that Cream committed. He was a serial poisoner. So his victims died horrible deaths from strychnine poisoning. I wanted to know how he got away with it. That's why the subtitle is The Hunt for a Victorian era serial killer, because I wanted that to be the lens or the theme of the through line. How did he, not just what he was doing, but how did he continually get away with it in 3 countries over this time span, especially when concurrently he was often doing everything he could to draw attention to himself.
Yeah, and we'll get to that. That's definitely a question I want to ask you about, because that's seemed odd to me and interesting. But we'll get there eventually. But the way your book starts was also interesting to me, because in the prologue, it starts with him getting out of jail. and that's something I didn't expect. So tell us, situate us there a little bit.
Well, I start with Thomas Neill Cream emerging from Joliet Prison, Illinois State Prison in Joliet, Illinois, after serving 10 years of a life sentence for murder. This it's hard. Where do you start? Do you start at the beginning? Do you start with one of his murders? My editor at Algonquin Books, the American publisher, Amy Gash, came up with this idea. And again, it was just trying to think of where can you bring the reader into the story at a point where you can have the mystery or the, well, who is this guy? What's he been in prison for? And I was able to describe how easy it was for an ex-convict to disappear, which becomes very important to Cream because you meet him in 1891. He has already murdered at least 6 people. He's gone to prison for one. He's been acquitted at trial of another murder that he obviously committed. And other murders, even if he was a suspect, he was never charged. So you're catching him midway. But he's also about to stage, he's going to a bigger stage. He's going to go to London, England, and start preying on women in this impoverished neighborhood of Lambeth and become notorious as the Lambeth poisoner. And he's going to kill again. So
this is following in the wake of the Jack the Ripper murders.
Well, that's right. And he's going to London just 3 years after Jack the Ripper. And that was an important part of the story because one of the reasons Cream was able to get away with so many murders in so many places was the idea of the serial killer was still so novel. Jack the Ripper being one of the prime examples. H.H. Holmes in Chicago, the famous The Devil in the White City, hadn't been caught yet and hadn't committed most of the murders he's been have been attributed to him. So Cream was really one of the first of what you could see in the police reports, the press, a real feeling that this was some kind of new monster that was emerging in Victorian society. One paper, the Chicago Tribune, said, this is someone who killed just for the sake of killing. I mean, that's how novel it was. It was recognized as a new kind of murder. So yes, he comes very closely on the heels of Jack the Ripper, and of course kills mostly sex workers in an impoverished area of London, just like the Ripper had in 3 years before.
So you definitely get the sense that the detective field is trying to grapple and process with this type of killer, something novel, like you said. What was the status of detective work in the 1880s and 1890s?
One of the challenges I had was I'm working over a 15-year period because Cream's incarceration interrupts his murder spree. He really kills 10 people in about 5 years, all told. So I had to get a sense of what was the state of policing and detection in 3 different countries at 3 different stages of development, some of them small areas, almost rural areas, some of them big cities like Chicago. And ultimately, the best window I had was Scotland Yard. I mean, the premier, or one of the premier detective and policing agencies on the planet in the 1890s. And fortunately, thick files of that investigation are at the National Archives in London. And I was able to see almost day by day, report by report, witness statement by witness statement, see just how the police, the miscues, the missed opportunities, the failure to put murders together, and how this aided Cream. One of his first victim in London, even though it was clearly a case of strychnine poisoning, was attributed to natural causes. The next death of a woman was attributed to suicide, even though even the police said, "But I wonder how she got a hold of this restricted poison." So anyway, so luck, miscues, but it was really intriguing to see. So the policing, the detective, the professional detective was just something that was starting to come into to play. And but in lockstep with that was the problem that forensics were still pretty crude. They could detect strychnine, but some of the experiments they used, I described one of them, was the best they could do to say, well, is this strychnine is to inject fluid recovered from cadavers into a frog or a mouse and see if the death throes look like death by strychnine. I mean, it's pretty primitive forensics.
Yeah, in one case, I think you said they fed part of the victim's stomach to a cat to see if the cat died.
That had been done in a similar case at that time. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And in Cream's case, I think it was frogs.
Mhm.
And of course, the defense lawyer was trying to make the obvious case for a non-scientific minded jury. Isn't there a lot of difference between a human being and a frog in terms of what you might see? But all of that was fascinating. But again, it was so important to underpinning and explaining my central question: how on earth did this guy get away with it for so long and so many deaths?
So can you, without giving too much away, just kind of briefly describe his early murders there as the Lambeth poisoner, and kind of Scotland Yard's first efforts to look into it, or half-hearted efforts, I guess?
Well, hindsight is 2020, and I do recognize that as I'm going through these records. And it was intriguing to think that, here's the police agency that has been widely criticized for blowing the Ripper investigation. So only 3 years before, they were facing this mad slasher in Whitechapel. And there's echoes of that. But I almost got the sense that the Ripper seemed to be a one-off at that time. Like Cream is the next major serial killer that hits London. And, it's obviously, it's a different method, but piecing together, there still was this problem. It hadn't captured the popular imagination that that any fiend would kill and kill and kill like the Ripper had and like Cream did, or really just for the sake of bloodlust or killing. So he comes to London, and a quick backstory: he is an accredited doctor. He born in Scotland, came to Quebec City in Canada as a child, went to McGill Medical School, one of the best medical schools in North America. And when he got out, started to kill women, killed his young bride, was his first victim, killed a female patient in Canada. When he was a suspect in that murder, he skipped to the United States, killed 4 more people in Illinois, eventually went to prison. So when he gets out, he has had lots of chance to hone his craft, for want of a better word. So when he came to London, he was a formidable adversary. He had figured out how to put strychnine in gelatin capsules, which were a fairly new thing, but were time release type capsule. We're used to that now. Mm-hmm. It was a new thing, especially in England at the time. But he had figured out he could disguise the bitter taste of strychnine. It's hard to get someone to willingly take strychnine, and it's hard to mask. But his medical training meant he knew this. So he starts distributing these pills to women he's selected in a ghoulish way. He certainly he frequented prostitutes in Lambeth. Some of them he selected to kill. He was a doctor. He wasn't licensed to practice, but his victims trusted him because he was a doctor. A doctor offers a pill, says it'll help with some minor malady, and the victim unfortunately trusts them to their peril. So it took Scotland Yard a long time to identify Cream and something that had benefited Cream in the past. It also took them a long time to get their head around, and you can see this in the files. Some of the lead detectives were like discounting him because he was a doctor, and somehow that didn't register with them that he could also be the serial killer they're looking for. His status as a doctor often shielded him from suspicion.
He kind of seems to consciously leverage that.
Oh yes, I mean one of his defenses when he was acquitted of a murder in Chicago after a botched operation, his lawyer said, he's look at his degree from McGill, look at his license from the University of Edinburgh, which was sort of the gold seal of medical training, and said to the jury, how could he have done how could he have been the butcher who did this job? And he's acquitted. One of many examples. But when you're saying he leveraged it, there's a whole sub text here that emerges of Cream writing letters, casting blame, muddying the waters, forging documents that escalates throughout his murders to the point where he's actually sending blackmail letters to innocent people who happen to be prominent, accusing them of murders he's committed, trying to get money out of them, even though he never collects. And some of these letters, he very carelessly writes in his own handwriting. Others he had someone else write. And these ultimately start tying him to the murders. And this becomes key to cracking the case.
Hey guys, Kevin here. I wanted to share with you a new development with the podcast. It is coming to you from a new podcast hosting service, Anchor.fm. So far, I'm really impressed. I really like it. Number one, it's free, which is always great. It's also integrated with Spotify and offers some great analytics on who's listening. Helps me gain some insight into what content would be good for the audience. And you can also record from your phone, which is a nice new feature that I'm using right now. So if you have a podcast or you're interested in starting one, download the Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. Yeah, this is the strange thing that he does, and it seems to be compulsive in a way, because realistically, he could have poisoned these women, and if he just laid low, no one ever would have suspected him. But he keeps putting himself into the center of the investigation again and again.
Well, it's like he's a moth to a flame. It's like he can't help himself because, again, for your listeners, this is after he's committed 6 murders and spent 10 years in prison. And he'd already tried some of these shenanigans with forged letters. In a couple of cases, he poisoned women and tried to blackmail a druggist, saying they had messed up the prescription and put strychnine in. That didn't work. But he kept on. Well, if madness is defined as doing something over and over again, expecting a different result, Cream had this madness in him. It was almost like not so much that he wanted to be caught, but he was so reckless that, and there was some speculation afterwards, one of the Scotland Yard investigators, not directly involved in the case, but a senior manager there, was, of all things, and this is in the book, chatting with the trial judge and saying that, well, what would have prompted Cream? And the sort of conclusion was that he couldn't help himself. He felt he was so clever and so skilled. He had to somehow draw attention to himself. He had to somehow be validated or have the world know how clever he was. Because not only is he writing these dangerous letters, dangerous for his freedom, he even starts hanging out with some Scotland Yard policemen, going to bars and talking about the murders. And at first they think, well, he's just into the local gossip mill. But finally, finally, because Cream's final act is he kills 2 women in the same night. That really made Scotland Yard stand up and take notice. And suddenly he went from this kind of eccentric character on the edge of Lambeth's low life or wild side to a guy who knew too much and was worthy of suspicion. And that's when things finally turned.
All right, so we talked about how Dr. Cream kind of exploited, his status as a doctor and the expectations of a doctor to his advantage. But how did he also kind of exploit Victorian society and a lot of its prejudices?
Well, one of the 9 out of Cream's 10 victims were women, and invariably there were two classes really: the sex workers of Lambeth, but before that, in North America, in Canada, and in Chicago, they were women who were trying to end unwanted pregnancies. They were seeking an illegal abortion, and Victorian society was so rigid about the idea of a birth out of wedlock that these women were desperate. And Cream was happy to provide this service. And so, unlike a Jack the Ripper, who's out there stalking women, Cream's victims are coming to him. They're seeking him out. They're coming to him in desperation. And he is just so cruelly betraying that trust. He's giving them what he says is medicine that would induce a miscarriage, which was a common form of attempted abortion at the time. But what he was giving them was medication laced with strychnine that he knew would kill them. So that was an absolutely appalling and chilling aspect of this story of how he abused his position as a doctor and in a sense played God. I mean, he by my research, he did have at times busy practices. He had other patients. He didn't kill everybody he came in contact with. But for some reason, he decided some of these patients, some of these women would die and some would live. And that is just absolutely sort of the most nightmarish aspect of this nightmarish story. And his unwitting accomplice in that are the attitudes of Victorian society that were so misogynistic and so close-minded about women who were desperate and desperate straits.
And a lot of these women are people who Victorian society wouldn't necessarily miss.
That's right. I mean, one thing I tried to do was give some dignity back to the victims. Mm-hmm. There hasn't been a lot written on Cream, not many books. But one thing, when I've seen his story retold in, say, in anthologies and things, victims' names are wrong. Victims aren't even identified. And I really tried to do some research to find out more about, the woman who was a waitress and trying to support her ailing mother back in Canada, the woman who had gone to an eye clinic and stayed on to volunteer. I mean, these were just women, single women struggling in a society where it was tough to be a single woman. Mm-hmm. And they made a mistake. They went to Cream thinking he could help them. Mm-hmm. And this became his pool of victims. So I thought that was important. And, that these weren't just, the 10 wasn't a statistic. It's, these were real people. And they just unfortunately, crossed paths with the wrong person.
And, we talked about resonance to today. These are still lingering problems in a lot of ways.
That's right. I mean, I talk about the Yorkshire Ripper case, where a truck driver was preying on sex workers in England. There were references in some of the police reports at Scotland Yard to the unreliability of these women, meaning the sex workers of Lambeth, mm-hmm. who the police were trying to question to find out more about victims, or this mysterious man they were trying to identify that turned out to be Cream. So you saw some of those attitudes. the idea that they, not that they deserved what had happened, but they were putting themselves in peril, and somehow this was their fault. You did see echoes of that at times.
Now, being that he's a poisoner in the late 1800s, murders involving poisons, that's kind of an investigator's worst nightmare. Why is that?
Well, partly because of sanitary conditions and epidemics and disease at the time. Many poisons mimicked the kind of symptoms or death throes that you might get from natural causes or disease. Strychnine is actually known for horrible, uncontrollable muscle spasms and contortions, and they're called tetanic because they mimic the signs of tetanus poisoning or tetanus. So skilled doctors could tell the difference usually, but that did point to this problem of it was an era when death could come swiftly, it could come to young and old. Infant mortality rates were just appallingly high. So it did mean that, coupled with the limits of forensic testing, and arsenic before Cream's time had been the poison of choice for a poisoner. Readily available. It was used for tons of household products or in rat poison.
Not to interrupt, but when you say readily available, I mean, how easy was it to get this stuff?
Well, until I think I say in the book, till the 1840s, it wasn't even restricted. Mm-hmm. As far as I know, you could get as much as you wanted. And there were regulations brought in, but most importantly, a test to detect arsenic came in, and that was the big deterrent. But then strychnine was one of a family of plant alkaloids, they're called, plant toxins that were being discovered through the late 1800s. And the toxin being discovered, there would be a lag before the test to identify could be developed. So that was the kind of world that it almost became, I've seen it described almost as an arms race to figure out which would win out, who would with the poisoners were in ascendancy until the scientists could come up with the tests to detect what they were using. And strychnine was one of those poisons.
So how does the media and the general public take to all this? You talk quite a bit in the book about how the public's becoming really intrigued with detective fiction, like Sherlock Holmes. How's the public reacting to stories in the paper about we might have another serial killer on the loose?
Well, an intriguing aspect of this for me was the timing. Cream's crimes in London, 1891-92, almost perfectly coincide with the first dozen Sherlock Holmes stories, which is what put Sherlock Holmes and Arthur Conan Doyle, their meteoric rise in detective fiction. And in fact, in the midst of Cream's rampage, the Strand magazine publishes the Adventure of the Speckled Band story. And that's the one where Holmes says to Watson, the doctor who kills is the first of criminals. He has the nerve and he has the knowledge. And eerily, a doctor turned wrong named Cream was using his nerve and knowledge to murder people right under Conan Doyle's nose. So it all became part and parcel. But what was, and another aspect that was really interesting to me was the chasm between what detectives could do, and thanks to the sort of lightning fast deductions of Sherlock Holmes and his ability to close a case in 4,000 words, the public really got to expect so much more. To expect almost instant service. Like, why can't our detectives be more like Sherlock Holmes? And it was really intriguing for me to get memoirs of retired inspectors who had served in the 1890s and just see how much they detested Sherlock Holmes because it made their job so much harder. And one of them even said, well, it's not a parlor game. It's not, Sherlock Holmes and Conan Doyle made detection look easy, and as a result, even the most skilled detectives felt that they were being held to too high a standard. So that was part of it, but also that there was this the rise in detection fiction, but it was such interest in true crime. I mean, it was amazing for me. Again, as I said at the outset, I mean, we're in this era of exploding interest in true crime. But a quote I spotted in my research said, there's nothing that the average newspaper reader wants more than the goriest of murders with all the trimmings. I mean, that sounds like something you could write today, but that was actually in the Chicago Tribune in 1880. So for better or for worse, human nature, or at least our interest in true crime, may have ebbed and flowed, but it's not a new thing. And that was a really interesting aspect of this. I mean, when you go back to that era, I mean, this is front page news, and they didn't have court TV, but they would publish verbatim testimony of trials. And if it took 3 pages of a 4-page daily newspaper, which was typical at the time, they'd do it.
And people tuned in every day to get the update.
Well, that's right. I mean, the newspapers wouldn't publish it if there wasn't an insatiable demand to read it.
Right.
And so that's kind of, and that's one of the things I like about is seeing that the more things change, the less in some ways they change. So that interest in true crime existed even then.
Yeah, you could easily picture there being a true crime podcast if podcasts were around.
Well, that's right. And as I said, I mean, to think of it, if you picked up, well, do people still pick up newspapers? But let's say you log on to your news website, and there's a link to the entire testimony of the previous day's important trial in your town. That's what they, would you do that? Well, interest was such as at the time that, yeah, people would do that.
We just watched 3 nonstop weeks of Johnny Depp and Amber Heard. So
that's right. So what I guess I'm saying is don't feel as bad about that as maybe you thought you did.
So I guess the last thing I want to ask you is, people are, like we talked about, are still fascinated with true crime and serial killers. Why do you think it is that Thomas Cream is not better known than he is? People know a lot about Jack the Ripper. They know a lot about, Ted Bundy, for instance. All serial killers. Why do you think that Cream isn't as well known?
Well, I'm glad he wasn't. And again, as I said, he was this figure that I had heard a lot about and seen references to. And there've been, oddly, there've been more fiction written based on his life than there have been books of nonfiction. And in fact, there was a very good scholarly book called Prescription for Murder in the early 1990s. It was the only other major book beyond the British Notable Trials series, which he was well known enough at the time. And I quote in the book George Orwell talking about the British interest or enthusiasm for murders in the Sunday papers, and saying, there are some killers who will never be forgotten, and one of them was Cream, and ironically, Cream was. And I'm not sure, maybe the fact that no one country could claim them in a way. Canada's never really been like all that keen to claim them as one of their own sons. maybe because it's so complex. But I do see that. I see fascinating cases that I wonder why they aren't better known. I'm glad this one wasn't, but it also did with a lot of threads and a lot of information to be drawn together. I mean, I traveled to London. I traveled to spots in Canada and Chicago and a northern town called Belvedere in Illinois, where he was actually convicted in that city. It wasn't all in one place, and perhaps that's been more challenging in the past. Um, but I obviously felt it was a story that did deserve to be better known,
Absolutely.
uh, and I really think because of what it says about the era, his victims, who are mostly women.
All right. Well, your book is it's an interesting murder tale. It's interesting window into what Victorian society was like. A lot of things that I think people tend to forget how society used to be. So if people are interested in this tale and they want to learn a little bit more, uh, where can they go?
They can go anywhere. It's published in the United States by Algonquin Books. It was published last year. It's coming out in paperback in July. HarperCollins Canada has published it here. It's actually being translated into French and Japanese. So those editions are coming. And so it's available bookstores everywhere and, of course, online. And people can check out my website, deanjobb.com, for more information on that and other books and links.
Okay. Well, Dean, thank you so much for joining us again.
Well, thank you.
Well, I hope you enjoyed this episode. Big thank you to Dean for coming back on the podcast to share his knowledge and just all the really good research that he does when he writes these books. And big thank you to you, the listeners. It means a lot whenever you come and hang out with me and learn about some history. If you're really enjoyed the case of the Murderous Dr. Cream, there is some bonus Q&A with Dean over on Patreon. If you've been hanging out for a while, or if you're new, and you'd like to stay in touch with the podcast, look up at CMTU History on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, TikTok. The show is also on YouTube if you like to check out podcasts that way. Over the next few weeks this summer, have a great lineup ahead. Definitely becoming a busy year with the podcast, especially since it's the first few months after a year-long hiatus. So next up will be another returning guest, Eric J. Dolan, who writes maritime history, will be joining us to talk about privateering during the American Revolution. And after that, I recently wrapped up an interview with David Hendy from the UK, who has written a great history commemorating the 100-year span of the BBC. So really interesting history about the corporation, as they call it in the UK, about their history. And then looking into the more distant future, I'll be talking with Mark Lee Gardner. His book, The Earth is All That Lasts, diving into some history of indigenous peoples here in America, looking at Crazy Horse, Sitting Bull, and the Sioux Nation. So looking forward to that. And also recently got another book in the mail. Really excited about this. It is a book about King Arthur that I can't wait to tell you more about. Super cool. It's very well illustrated in kind of a Lord of the Rings fashion. So plenty of stuff to look forward to. I look forward to seeing you guys again in a few weeks. Bye. Hey, and one more thing I want to mention. If you subscribe to the podcast, you might have noticed that the last couple of episodes to pop up were just these little mini episodes. They're like 6 minutes long, that I did with my kids. I know they're kind of silly. My son talked about dinosaurs. My daughter talked about, opined about UFOs and fangirled over Queen Elizabeth. But, like over 100 people downloaded each of those and checked them out. So I just wanted to say thank you to that. I know they're not really history and they're not really tied with what I'm doing here, but it meant a lot to them. They think it's super cool that 100 people across the globe listen to them. So just thank you so much for listening to them. That means a lot to them, and it means a lot to me. You guys are really a great audience.